All right, recording from our respective locations, I'm Matthew Huffman, Public Affairs Director at MCADSV, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition, connecting advocates across our state. So this month is April, and it's Sexual Assault Awareness Month, but I really wanted to have the conversation this month focused on a part of sexual assault awareness that I don't think really gets a lot of awareness, and that's the topic of sexual and reproductive health. Earlier this month, three members of our prevention team held a statewide training called Let's Talk About Sex. And they did a fantastic job talking about sex and really trying to get past some of those uncomfortable things that some of us don't always feel comfortable bringing into conversation when we're working with people, when we're trying to do education and outreach. But they made a topic that can be considered taboo very accessible and very informative. So, with such applause and outstanding evaluations, I felt like we probably ought to bring these folks onto Momentum and have a deeper conversation. So, Havana, Nora, Sam, welcome back to Momentum.
Thanks,
Hi.
Matthew.
So, I want to jump right into this conversation because the three of you gave such a fantastic training earlier this month. I was able to attend, took a ton of notes, looked at the evaluations after they came in. All of them were just glowing. And like I kind of said in the introduction, I think the topic of sexual and reproductive health is still kind of considered taboo. Something that really stood out for me in the beginning of that training was whenever you did a poll question asking, how comfortable are you having conversations about sex and sexual health and reproductive health? And the majority of advocates who responded said, yeah, we're comfortable or somewhat comfortable, but I still don't really think that it's a topic that really gets its due attention in our work. So, want to turn this over to the three of you really quickly to just kind of talk about, as you went through that training and as you were developing it, what's something that really stood out to each of you?
Well, I would definitely say this is a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts. And it was something that it started coming around because Nora and I previously had done the medical trainings and we got really strong responses and people were really interested in the section that we did on reproductive health and reproductive advocacy. And we kind of realized like the gap in knowledge, like the problem with there's no accepted base knowledge that we can just kind of all say, like, you know, like if I say the Revolutionary War, like you might not know everything about it, but you know, like it was in the late 1700s and it had to do with like, you know, breaking away from the colonies breaking away from Britain. And like if I talk about like 2 + 2 is 4, or everybody knows what a square or a rhombus is, but there's zero like accepted cultural, like this is the benchmark on like when it comes to reproductive health. And that was really kind of what we were trying to figure out is there's nothing that we could, and that's what we learned in medical when we did it, is there was nothing that we could say that we could assume was knowledge that everybody in the room had. And so it made putting together a training about it especially daunting, which is why it was fantastic to have like all three of us working on it together. But I think for us and like, or I would say for my part, and I think that was one of the things that we brought to it, was that what was most important to us is that people started kind of thinking about it as the scope. Like we wanted to do a, like, I don't know, the beer flight of trainings where we're like, we want you to kind of like we want people to start thinking about reproductive advocacy as something that is just pervasive and it's deeply entwined with what you are already doing and how important it is to people at all areas of their lives, at all times in their lives. And so like, we wanted to give them such a large thing to think about that they realize that it is such actually already a normal part of people's lives that it's not necessarily, hopefully, gonna feel as taboo. It feels a lot more like everything else that you do, would be my 2 cents.
I agree with you, Sammy. You kind of hit what I was thinking on the head there, where I think what stood out to me is just like how many opportunities there are for advocates to have a positive impact on survivors' sexual and reproductive health. And as we kind of talked through it with the advocates that were at the training, it just became really clear that advocates can do so much around these issues of sexual and reproductive health. And that was really exciting to hear about.
Yeah, and for me, I kind of looked at it from the standpoint of I'm a survivor and I'm a mother. And what are those things that I needed when I was learning about everything from being pregnant to exams to childbirth and everything else, and how could that have been improved? And so looking at it from that standpoint and being an advocate as well, pardon me, what did I not have? I didn't have all of those tools. A lot of the knowledge and things that I learned was based off my own experience. While good, everybody may not have that experience. So I was like, this is a great opportunity to expand like your scope of work of being an advocate and being able to provide as close to the whole wraparound service as possible that you can. So I really enjoyed the training, and training with Sammy and Nora, of course, was like, yay, this is going to be fun. So it just made the experience even better, like training with some awesome trainers to begin with.
Yeah, the part that you did around childbirth had a big impact on me, Havana. So I'm glad you did that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like I said, I took a ton of notes from your training, and the three of you did such an amazing job covering just a wealth of topics. And Havana, I really appreciate something that you just said, and I want to lift that up of you thinking about your experience as a survivor and a mother and what would have been good for you to know. I really think about that topic a lot for myself of as a young queer person growing up in the South, what information did I not have and what did that mean for me? And I think that's such a really important thing to bring to our work is the personal experience that we have around the topic and what do we wish would have been available. And Sam, that reminds me of something that you said a moment ago too, of there really isn't a universal definition of sexual health that is widely accepted and understood. And for a variety of reasons, like not everybody has access to sex education. There are a lot of family and cultural dynamics that play into that as well. And so, yeah, I think that those are two really important aspects that we don't have a common definition and understanding of what sexual and reproductive health really is, and largely because it plays out so differently for everyone.
And we don't have like a collective comfort level around it by any means, and I think that is a leading cause of sexual violence is just not having a comfort level around talking about issues of sex and consent.
And it's such a disservice to survivors everywhere, especially the people, and I know we're going to go into it more, but some of the people who are at kind of the highest risk of experiencing sexual violence. If we don't give them language to describe what is happening to them, what they're experiencing, then they can't come forward and tell their stories in a way that they can get the help that they need. Because if I don't have the language to describe what happened to my body, what's going on in my body, if I don't understand what consent is or what boundaries are, or when it's okay when somebody touches me in a certain place and when it isn't, and like that fact that I can say no, we're just leaving the people who are most vulnerable in our communities completely at the whims of people who have no compunction about taking complete advantage of them. And then we're failing them from the get-go by not even helping them have the basic language to describe what they've experienced.
I agree. I think that goes across like a lot of different, different lines, because you can also think about like the lack of that conversation doesn't bring words to those situations. And you kind of, in my mind, the first thing that comes to my thought is the young ladies and young men that were in gymnastics camps and like these doctors, your thought is to like trust the doctor. It doesn't feel right, but you haven't had a conversation that this is inappropriate and that certain arousals and feelings is normal, but that still was inappropriate because you're still a minor. So I do think that's very important to have those conversations that may be uncomfortable, but really are valid later on as you go on in life.
There is a direct connection between domestic and sexual violence and reproductive health issues such as unplanned pregnancies and STIs and HIV. That connection is direct, and there's research there to back it up. And so as an advocacy movement, the work to increase access to sexual and reproductive health care is the work of supporting survivors.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And Nora, I want to expand on that a little bit because you started out the training by really drawing those clear connections between the domestic and sexual violence movement and the sexual and reproductive health movement. And you gave a really great quote by Sister Song as a way of opening up the conversation. So I was wondering, could you share that with us and give a quick kind of history lesson for folks who weren't able to attend the training about those connections and just how deep they really go?
Sure. So let me start off with the history and then we'll get to Sister Song because it'll bring me to the whole reproductive justice movement. But I wanted to start just with a brief discussion of the history of the reproductive rights movement because I think it really provided context for understanding what issues survivors are facing related to the reproductive health and what resources are available and also not available to survivors based on the history of what's happened in our country around access to reproductive health services. So I started with just kind of the turn of the century. The medical industry became increasingly medicalized and medicine was being practiced by doctors, and stuff around like pregnancy and childbirth that used to be handled by midwives was no longer handled by midwives. It was legislated that midwifery was often banned. And that was the first kind of like public policy around reproductive health that we saw in this country, but it launched a lot of other laws that followed related to reproductive health after that. So there was also kind of this birth control movement where there's a big social movement that was a public health movement really to encourage the use of contraception and birth control. The birth control pill was invented in the 60s. That increased access to contraception for a lot of people. There was some legislation around that as well. And then the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s really took on the cause for abortion rights. Abortion was illegal in the United States until then. And because of their work in 1973 with the passage of the Supreme Court ruling of Roe versus Wade, abortion became legal in Missouri, in the United States. But then in the 90s, the Supreme Court ruled that abortion could still be legal, but it could be restricted by states. And so that really polarized the reproductive health movement in terms of anti-abortion and abortion rights. And that's what a lot of work around reproductive health became about throughout the 90s, was really that focus on abortion. And then in the mid-90s, a group of women of color got together and they were like, wait a minute, that's not capturing the reality of women's choices around reproductive rights. It's not just about to have an abortion or not to have an abortion. There's so many more issues going on. And that was the beginning of the Sister Song, of the reproductive justice movement and of the Sister Song Collective. They're a nationwide organization. They're a collective fighting for reproductive justice. And this is a framework that they developed combining the idea of social justice and reproductive health, right? So combining those two issues using kind of this human rights framework, saying there are inherent rights that people have as human beings to reproductive health. And it is the right to choose to have a child. It is the right to choose not to have a child. And then very importantly, it is the right to raise children in healthy and safe environments. And that's the quote that I shared from Sister Song. And that is really kind of the framework that we used for this training to incorporate not just a training about abortion or birth control or STIs and HIV, which is what we commonly think of when we think of reproductive health, but we wanted to cast a very comprehensive framework and include all of these issues that survivors are coming to programs with. In addition, I think that whole issue of raising children in safe and healthy environments directly implicates the movement to end domestic and sexual violence, because we wholeheartedly believe in safe and healthy environments for everybody as a human right. And so I thought we could get on board with that as well.
I agree. And I think that was such a really great way to open the conversation for that training. I think it grounds the work in that very direct connection. But I think, yeah, just like you said, Nora, it gives a really good philosophy to start the work from. So I appreciate you also sharing that out to kind of add to this conversation and really help draw those connections too.
The problem is that we only have one day, and we could have spent a year talking about these topics. So it was tough to get through it all in a day.
But we're hoping is that people will get excited enough that we'll get to do more topics and go more in depth about specific topics once people started to think of reproductive health, like in reproductive advocacy, like on the scope of its potential. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Well, and I think that's a really good point too, Sammy, because this was definitely a training that, yeah, has been discussed internally for a little while, but to have a specific one on sexual and reproductive health, I think is just a really important thing for us to continue the conversation on. And in looking over the evaluations, it very much seems like advocates want to continue to have this conversation. One of the things that really stood out for me is that a comment that someone made is they would like additional information on comprehensive sex education for people with disabilities. And something that y'all spend a lot of time talking about in your training is the need to have comprehensive, inclusive, affirming sex education for people with multiple identities. And Sam, you did a really great job at bringing that topic into the conversation and showing a video. So I wonder if you can just give a little bit of an overview about that video and how you introduced the topic during the training.
Yeah, I will. So the video is one that's done is on sexual self-advocacy. And what it actually was this group of people in the disabled community who talked about what sex education, like why they think they should have appropriate sex education. They talked about the things they want and the things they want out of relationships and the things that they want out of sex. They talked about the dignity of being trusted to make their own decisions in regards to their bodies and the fact that they are fully formed, like adult human beings and people existing in the world who need the right to be able to explain what's happening to them and to talk about it and to have needs, and that they're human. And so they get to have that whole breadth of the human experience. And watching as like people are just like, and I really loved the idea of starting it off by having people from that community explain why it's important to them, because I think it's really easy for us to talk about people that we don't necessarily have a strong understanding of and think that we know best. And one of the things that I really find fascinating when they talk about like the disabled community, one of the things they'll talk about is the phrase like dignity of risk. And they talk about the fact that it's a big thing that caretakers will talk about a lot, because it's what dignity of risk is like, what are the things that I'm allowed to screw up because I'm a human without losing everything? Like this expectation that if I have a disability and I mess something up, like, does that mean I lose everything and I have to have someone follow me all around all the time, or all of a sudden I have to go to a home, or all of a sudden I have to do this? Like the dignity of risk is like the fact that you are a fully fledged human being, which means we help you find and like obtain the information that you need so that you're able to feel and be a human being. And I think just, and the research shows that what you were talking about, Matthew, is that the people, we talked about multiple identities because those are the people who are at the crux of like the most likely to be experiencing sexual violence and have the least access to appropriate reproductive health or resources about it. And so if you are someone who was never given sex education because somebody else had already decided for you that you were never going to have sex, or you were never going to be able to have a healthy functioning relationship, so like to take that information away, it means that it's leaving you open to be exploited by people who know you don't have that knowledge. So we are putting people more at risk. And then also, once they're even more at risk, they also then won't have the language to describe the experiences that they had. So then they can't even ask for help. So we're just failing like astronomically, people in these communities, the disabled communities. One of the things that we ended up talking about a lot was in the transgender community, And the research that says that there's like 80% of trans people stated that they had to teach their doctor about how to provide reproductive health care, which is just beyond the pale. Like, the amount of information that's just not available to people because we've decided that only certain people deserve reproductive health care and deserve to learn about reproductive health care is just really, truly horrifying. And they deserve better from us.
Yeah, Sam, I really appreciate what you just said. And the thing that really resonates is that we end up doing more harm to people by limiting their access to information. And I think that that is so incredibly true and a very powerful statement. By limiting access to education on sexual and reproductive health that is inclusive and affirming of people's identities, when we just ignore that fact, we put people at greater risk of experiencing danger and not being able to help them recover from that trauma too.
I totally agree. I think this information is very related to people's safety. And we are absolutely a movement that cares about people's safety. And so let's get on board with sharing information too, right?
Also appreciate that, Sammy, because it really reiterates the fact that we need to bring healthcare providers and workers like to the table so that they understand. Like, they're seeing it from probably one side of view because they're like, I need to get a client in, get it out so I can see the next patient. But we need to sit down and have like real conversations with them. Like, this isn't just a patient. This is what they're dealing with, and here are the long-term effects of it. This is like vicarious trauma, generational, and now you're putting on more trauma. So I think it's really important that we start having these conversations from the lens that every patient is different and you need to do your work and educate yourself just as much as we're trying to educate you too. So it can't always be put on the patient or the survivor to educate who's supposed to be taking care of them. So I think that's
where advocates can just do so much like phenomenal work, you know, by just reaching out to people in your community, because there's tons of resources that already exist. There are a lot of fantastic resources that already exist about sex education, like appropriate sex education for people with all sorts of disabilities or from all sorts of like backgrounds or experiences. Reproductive, like there's tons of stuff about reproductive health care for men and adolescent boys and people who are transgender and people who are non-binary. Like, there's fantastic resources that have already been made. So it's not even like find them. They just need to look at them. And one of the things that advocates can do is, if you have a relationship community with general practitioners, with all of those people, and you send someone in there to talk to them, then we're not putting it all on a survivor to have to come in, because the things that we end up talking about a lot just in general when it comes to advocacy is that survivors pick up on things very quickly. Like, we'll talk about it a lot. Like, in order for them to keep themselves safe, a lot of times they're very hyper attentive to the signals that somebody else is giving in conversation. And if I'm telling you, and I can tell this is not something you've ever thought about in your entire life, then I already know that you don't care enough about me to have ever learned this or to even know where to look for this. So how am I going to share things that are even more personal, that are even more devastating, that even maybe the people who I love and have been with me my whole life and might even be from my community I haven't shared with? Everybody always tells them is that as a survivor, like as an advocate, you don't have to know everything, but you have to know that you can find the things that you need. And so that's really what it is. Like, not anybody has to go in and like know everything about how to talk to someone with autism about sex education. And you don't have to know everything about transgendered reproductive health care, but you should know that you can find stuff, that you've thought about it enough that when somebody comes up to you and they say, hey, I just had the worst thing that's ever happened to me my entire life, and I'm terrified and I don't know you, and this is a big moment for me, especially if I'm someone who has only received very negative responses about me sharing anything about my personal identity without the trauma that I've just experienced. It's just, I don't know. It's important.
It is. And
It
I think we
really
did a really good job of putting that workbook of resources together for everyone. So hopefully they will find those tools that we gave them pretty useful. And if you all didn't watch it, then just reach out to us. We'll be happy to get it to you. So, we can continuously do the great work throughout the state.
Yeah, and I think that Havana and Sam, you both bring up a really good point of we can't put the burden on survivors and on individuals to be educating others. It's really the work of advocates and healthcare providers to be educating ourselves and building those connections to each other and building those networks so the burden doesn't fall on survivors.
Mhm.
Sam, there was another topic that you brought into the conversation during the training that I thought you just did so eloquently. And, I think oftentimes when we're thinking about sexual and reproductive health, and Nora, you even alluded to this earlier, oftentimes it's really associated to STI prevention, pregnancy prevention, but we don't always talk about sexual and reproductive health through the lifespan. That said, Sam, you did a great job bringing up the topic of menopause and talking about it in an open and candid way. So I wanted to touch on that here too.
Sure. Well, I am embarrassed to say that as someone who's never gone through menopause, it took an alarmingly long time before we were like, oh yeah, this is something that we need to put in the training because this is something that is important and relevant. So when we say that people don't necessarily think of all of these things as reproductive health care, like that includes us who were like doing research and creating a training about it. Like we were still like up until the last day, like, oh man, like do we have time to talk about this? Or we didn't even think about talking about this. Like it's just such a massive topic. But menopause was one that we ended up talking about for a very long time. Once we remembered that it exists, very embarrassingly, because it is such a formative thing in people's lives. It is something that is actually like on its own a major life change that people are going to have a lot of feelings about, and that can be incredibly difficult for them to deal with. And one of the things that we kind of talk about with like basic knowledge, like if I don't have basic knowledge about how something normally is, then I don't know how to understand or explain how when something changes. Right. And so this actually, not knowing things about things like menopause could actually become a safety risk for people who are in abusive relationships. So before we go that, I'll do a little bit about menopause. So one of the things that is that I'm going to be honest, I don't know a lot about menopause. It's not something that I have experienced yet because I'm eternally youthful. No, it's not like, talk about that. Like what menopause is, it's that time in your life when you stop having your period because of a hormonal change. And while it normally happens to people in their late 40s or early 50s, it can also happen a lot earlier. Like it's, it can happen to you because of if you have like certain surgeries, if you're taking certain medications, if you're taking certain things like, so like it's not exclusively for that age area, which is why I do think it is important for people to know kind of throughout their lives that this is something that can happen to them. So you have that base knowledge. So menopause is super natural and it's normal. It's just a part of being someone with a uterus and ovaries, is that at some point you will experience this. And it starts as it was when the ovaries stop making estrogen and it slows down your other reproductive hormones. And so without these hormones, you stop getting your period, so you stop being able to get pregnant. But it's not like there's like a switch. And that's why it's important to know things like about menopause, because there's the leading up to menopause, there's perimenopause, which I did not know about. So this is things that I'm learning. And like this is a stage that can last from like a few months to up to 10 years before full-on menopause kicks in. And it's something that like all of a sudden, like you might have the time between your periods are changing. You might be totally skipping periods. Your eating patterns might change during your periods. You might be eating between periods. So like a lot of things that you might have at this point like known about your body start to change. But during perimenopause, you can still get pregnant. So just because your body is changing and you're thinking like, oh, I must be menopause, like I'm in my late 40s, this is what's going on, that might not actually be the case. And so there's a couple of other things. One, like when we talk about menopause, we talk about the fact that it has to do with hormones, which means that there are actually treatments you can get, because people will have a variety of different symptoms and they affect people differently, just like people experiencing, PMS, experiencing it differently. Like, it's definitely your own body. Some of the very common signs is they'll see is that people will get really hot, or they have to use the bathroom all of the time, or they get sweats at night, or you're really, really moody and frustrated, or all of a sudden you're really dry, like down in your vaginal area, down in your genitals and stuff like that. Like, just a complete lack of comfort. There's hormone treatments that are actually able to help with those symptoms of menopause, if that's something that is appropriate and useful for you. And so if you know that what menopause is that lack of estrogens, that change in hormones, then you also know that that's something that you could talk to your doctors about, and you might actually be able to do something to help, or you could at least do some sort of therapy or have conversations about what are different things that are available that you could do, and what are the risks. And the thing is just that menopause, like everything else, is a super normal part of your reproductive health. Now, when we talk about where it becomes like an issue of risk, it's like this. One of the things that we talk about, and is actually a resource that we have with our resources that we love, is about reproductive control, or reproductive coercion. And so there are, we know, in abusive relationships, a fair amount of parties who will monitor their partner's reproductive cycle in order to maintain control, either to force them to have children or to keep them from having children. So one of the things that we have, that we put out with our resources, is we put out a bunch of things about birth control, because it's something that is really important, and there's a ton of different things that come into play with it, and to think about what is the best form for somebody to use. But one of the things that was in there that I really loved is it talks about the detectability of certain types of birth control. And so it'll go into like, what is the risk of you being caught for this? Like, is this something that if you take this particular type of birth control, if you have this particular IUD, are you going to stop having your periods? Well, if you're in a relationship with somebody who's tracking your cycle, that might not be safe for you. So you might want to do a copper IUD as opposed to a hormonal IUD. Or if you're somebody who's like, they're going to find your pills. Okay, so then you may want to do a shot. So you're making these decisions with that full scope of information in mind. Now, if you're with somebody who's reproductively coercive and you're starting to go through perimenopause and menopause, and it's someone who's tracking your cycle, even if you have nothing else that's changing it, like if you don't understand that's what's happening, then it becomes a safety risk, because you can't safety plan around it. You can't figure out how to make the decisions that are going to keep yourself like the safest and prepared at the things that you need to do, because it's not just that switch. And so to be able to have that information, then you can plan appropriately on how to keep yourself safe and the kind of information you need and the things that you need to be prepared for. And that's why it's also really important for advocates to know these things, because people might not know to ask.
Amy brings up a really interesting point that I thought about throughout the training, and that is like, our role is to be experts on domestic and sexual violence, not to be experts on sexual and reproductive health, because there are people out there that go to work every day, and that's what they do is work to address issues around sexual and reproductive health. But I thought in our role as experts on domestic and sexual violence, we really needed to talk about all the ways that domestic and sexual violence intersect with reproductive health, such as the sexual and reproductive coercion that Sammy was talking about. So we did talk about that in the training. I thought that was really important, along with other things like Havana talked about how to support somebody who had experienced sexual violence, who was giving birth and might be triggered in that process. And I think that was a really helpful conversation to have too.
I also like how you brought up, Sammy, like about with menopause and just thinking about like the different changes that a woman or someone with like these female organs goes through between this age period. Like, if you're not aware of that as an advocate, you can mistake that for something else if you're in a shelter working with a survivor. Just some of those things to kind of have in the back of your head of, okay, let me think about this. And it also brings up something else that we're really, advocating for right now, which is the Medicaid expansion, right? So if we get the survivor that's from here or from out of state, or they were on their partner's insurance, or they need insurance, and like, this is something that's very important, right? Like, they need to have access to Medicaid, to healthcare, so they can get medications like this to help with some of these issues that they're going on, that's normal, that they're going to happen. Like, you're going to go through menopause, you can't avoid it. Like, it's going to happen. So that, you know, brings up a whole different issue about how important it is to know the health and history of your clients and how you can better assist them. Because if there's a lack of insurance, and there's something else that we need to talk about, and making sure that you're able to get coverage so that you can get this medication, you can see a doctor, and, you know, just layers upon layers of things that we can do.
Well, and what I didn't even mention, but is I was thinking about what you were saying, Havana, is that we know that trauma affects people physically. And so it'll physically affect the way people's brains process things. It physically affects the way that their bodies respond to stimuli and all sorts of things. So trauma can actually affect somebody's experience of menopause. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't know what menopause typically looks like, right, then you're not going to be able to like identify what's different because of the trauma you've experienced, which is, I think, is one of the things that's so important about having baseline information. Like, if I don't know how my body normally functions, mm-hmm, then I can't get help when my body starts to function differently, or I don't have the language to explain why my body is functioning differently, which means that if there's something truly wrong, it could go on for a very long time before I ever actually go and talk to somebody, or a healthcare professional, or any sort of expert in the field, or anybody else in my life about what's happening. So just that base knowledge is, for a multitude of reasons that we could go on forever and ever and ever about, is a game changer for people. Because in order for people to be empowered, in order for people to make autonomous decisions, they have to have enough information to be able to make a decision.
So one other area that I want to make sure we're able to touch on, especially, echoing what you just said, Sam, giving people access to information, is really thinking about maternal health and how maternal and child health intersects with domestic and sexual violence, both prevention and recovery. And Havana, I wanted to turn this over to you because among your many areas of expertise, one is maternal health. And you talked really in depth about maternal and infant mortality rates in Missouri. And just as Nora mentioned, really thinking about if someone is a survivor of sexual assault, what trauma might be brought up for them during childbirth? How might that trigger postpartum depression? So you covered a variety of topics there, and I wanted you to be able to touch on those in this conversation too.
Sure, thanks. So when you think about maternal mortality rate, like, that's from the time that they're pregnant, while they give a live birth, up until a year after pregnancy. So within that span, a woman can die from a number of reasons that's related to childbirth, whether it's whether it's sexual abuse, domestic violence, whether it's something health-wise that's going on. And all of those things play a significant role in the mortality rate, along with the mortality rate of children. In Missouri alone, 213 Black women per 10,000 live births die within 1 year, in comparison to white women who die at a rate of 92 per 10,000 women. And so if you just think about that, and think about the various layers of trauma that these women have possibly went through that may come through your shelter. You haven't asked them about that. You just know that they're pregnant, or they come with these children. But they have all of these layers of trauma, from maybe something they went through in childhood. Maybe they're on top of whatever this relationship that has them at your shelter or at your agency, on top of trying to parent, be a single parent, if they are a refugee, if their English isn't their first language. There are a lot of different layers on top of that. And as an advocate, our first main focus is to make sure that they're safe, but we're not thinking about anything else that they could have went through. And so I think it's really important that agencies, whether it's shelter or not, kind of look into being able to collaborate with doulas. So doulas play a unique role, that they are all trauma informed. Like, that's what they want, the best birth experience possible for everybody, not just to have a safe baby, because a lot of times that's the first thing everybody says, oh, we want to have a wonderful, healthy baby. But what about mom? Like, mom's being born too. She needs to be healthy and safe as well. And when doulas can come in and step in and have this informed approach where they're able to coach and talk the survivor into what's about to happen, what to expect, these are the things that are going to happen. That takes away some of the extra stress and trauma that can be a part of birthing a baby, and along with having a child that they may go into labor early because they have been abused, something traumatic has happened to them, and now their baby is being taken away from them, going to the ICU. That's more trauma on top of everything else that they've been through. So it's important to remember that when people come in pregnant or just having a baby, that there are other things that could have been playing a role, and we need to, yes, they definitely need they need the counseling for the domestic violence situation, but they also need the counseling for postpartum. Like, that's another thing. Like, they don't know what to think. All of these feelings are going around. Now you're going back into a shelter and you have these restrictions. You don't have any assistance. Like, what else am I supposed to do? And we forget about like that mental health component of postpartum. It's just like, oh, they're back here with this new baby. But there's so many different layers that we have to remember. And we put it in one of the toolkits, Futures Without Violence, did a really good webinar. And we hope to be able to provide one as well of how doulas can support our clients in these shelters and these agencies. And I think it's important to kind of look within your community for doula. Here in Missouri, since like they're like doula villages, I know of two. One in St. Louis is Jama Birth Center, and they're very trauma informed. They understand women that have been victims of violence and what it is that they can do to help them. And then Uzazi is in Kansas City, and they do the same thing. Like, they're really intentional about the sexual and reproductive health. So you get all of these added bonuses that you may not get from your caregiver who's just coming in really quick to take care of you. You get all of these other things of knowing what to expect, how to do things, and that parental guidance that goes beyond. Because also that window between you leaving the hospital and your first postpartum checkup is 6 weeks. A lot can happen in between 0 and 6 weeks that a lot of people don't think of, and they can kind of get lost in translation because everybody's focusing on baby. Baby gets all of these, and it's great, but let's not forget about the mom too, and all the trauma that the mom has been through as well. So we hope to be able to have some open talk so that our agencies can get to know some of the doulas in their area and how that they can work with them together. There may be funding out there that you can work collaboratively and be able to provide these services as an additional bonus. And if not, I think it's good for advocates just to kind of have an idea of the way things look from a person who's been through a traumatic experience and given birth. There was like a 1.5-minute video that we showed, and the woman is sitting there and nobody's telling her what's going on. The only thing they say is, you'll be okay, it'll be okay soon, it'll be over soon, or whatever the case. Can you imagine just sitting there having childbirth? This is a traumatic experience. Remember, you've already been a victim of violence, violating you and taking away your rights. And here we are, 6-7 people in front of you with a bright light doing the exact same thing again. So it's good to kind of look at things from a different standpoint of how you would feel if you were a victim and nobody was telling you what was happening. You're there all alone. So I just want to uplift like the fact that advocates do really good work. If we could just educate ourselves just a little bit more to be able to think about those moms sometimes and give them some more resources. We don't have to become a doula. If you do, that's great. I love that. But if not, just some advocates and somebody else for them to talk to that specialize in their area. So that's where those community collaborations come in. You know, I'm real big on that. So, you know, if you want any more information about that, we will be happy to like have those conversations and connect you with people in your community that are already in the mindset of doing trauma-informed care, and we don't have to reteach them how to take care of our clients.
I learned a lot from Havana about doulas. She's an expert on the topic. But one thing that I really thought was interesting in thinking about the work of doulas is that, you know, doulas are advocates for pregnant and for pregnant people and for people who've just had babies and for the childbirth process as well. So they are advocates for that process. And so I think they're natural friends for domestic and sexual violence advocates. A lot of the same principles of that work are principles of domestic and sexual violence advocacy programs too. So natural friends there. And then I'm really glad you brought up some of the racial disparities in maternal mortality and just thinking about social determinants of health and how racism really impacts reproductive and sexual health in a major significant way. And so just really naming that and those numbers clearly demonstrate that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point to bring up, Nora, and I'm really glad that you lifted that up, because I was wanting to do the same thing from something that you had mentioned, Havana, and it really is looking at social determinants of health and rooting so much of our advocacy work in that. So recognizing that intersection of racism as a public health issue, thinking about maternal and infant mortality as a public health issue, thinking about gender-based violence as a public health issue. And these three things we know overlap in a lot of areas. And so really centering our work in those areas of overlap, I think, is incredibly important for us to look at and meaningfully discuss and then put into practice.
Yeah, because survivors aren't coming to our programs just with issues of domestic and sexual violence. There's always a lot of other things going on, and they might have totally different priorities. And so we have opportunities to really meet those needs and to support survivors on whatever their priorities are.
And you also have to remember, like, that trauma kind of like blocks some of that, right? Like, you may not think that it's related, and that, you know, as an advocate, and they get more comfortable, they'll be able to like open up and talk to you more. Or as an advocate, you can, you know, suggest things like, oh, I know you have a little one. Like, have you ever thought about parenting groups? Like, how's parenting going through this situation right now? Or, you know, you're pregnant. Okay, so what kind of services are you getting? Have you had prenatal health care? Okay, they haven't, or they don't have insurance. We're back at that again. Like, what services and what agencies in your community can you directly connect them with to make sure that these social determinants of health have good outcomes? What can you do to make sure that when they leave your shelter, that they do have somewhere safe for the child to sleep, and they're, you know, able to lay flat, and they have the needs that they have? Like, there's so many different ways that we can kind of play a role, and there's so many different social service agencies that give away these things for free because they want to reduce that infant mortality rate. Like, if you just take a safe sleep class, you can get like up to 3 free items, like no matter what your income is and where you live. They just want, you know, babies to thrive and survive just along the same lines as the mothers. Like, we don't want to forget about the mothers as well, because they're being born too. So, you know, just having those resources at hand to be able to hand off and support. If we can't do everything, just knowing someone personally, you can pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I've got a new client. Let's try to hook you up with them, because, you know, they probably need your support. They may not jump at it initially, but if they have that resource, they may call them in a couple of weeks. So let's just give it to them.
That's a really good point, because I think when we talk about these disparities, we don't always follow up to say, like, these disparities are preventable. There's things that we can do in order to prevent these disparities in health. And one of those things we can do is provide supportive services that meet people's sexual and reproductive health needs, that decrease maternal mortality rates.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So much of it is like giving them the space to share, you know, like there's so many things I feel like that go along with reproductive health. Both the advocacy we have, but just like people's understanding of reproductive health in general, is that there's a deep levels of shame, and there are a lot of things that are seen as, at bare minimum, uncomfortable or impolite to talk about, all the way up to taboo, depending on where the intersections you live at or the life experiences that you've had. And so the amount of people who might come in going, oh, we don't talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about family stuff. And so unless we're there to say, like, hey, here's some resources that are available, right, if you're curious, you know, they might never ask you, because that is how deeply ingrained so many of these conversations are. And like the misunderstandings of things to go along with reproductive health, like everybody's heard like a million of those little urban legends that have to do with like sex and reproductive health. Like there's an infinite amount of them, and they're all truly horrifying. But the reason like those are able to kind of thrive and fester is because we're not giving good information that's able to like take root and then give people a healthy place to start from, you know. And people, it's overwhelming.
You made a good point, Sammy, that I like. That's kind of a thought. Of course, my mind is always thinking of, here's something we could try. But even if with making these partnerships within a community, maybe once a month, just have someone from that's a doula come and just talk about parenting and what to expect when expecting, you know, or having someone talk about the free options you have for birth control, whether or not you have insurance or not. Like just a monthly like community member forum or something that's very local. Everybody has to do community service. Everything doesn't have a cost or a price tag next to it. They have to do community education. So that may be one way to just kind of start the conversation organically, is by having special guests in your shelter or your agencies, and you invite out your clients. Just a thought.
Not that I mean, this issue is so big, we can't just do it alone. So who
Exactly.
are partners that can help us with this work?
Well, and the reality is like there's the amount of barriers that are there are overwhelming. Even if so many of the barriers might just be a little bit, like it's just a trip. But like if you keep tripping, eventually you're going to fall on your face. Like you're not going to be able to keep your balance. So anything that we can do that can kind of eliminate those barriers, that are those things that like, okay, what is the thing that's stopping you? You know, like I haven't been to a doctor yet, even though I suspect that I'm pregnant. Well, okay, what are the things that are stopping you from doing that? And if we're able to help people address those things, like what are the things in your life that are making that currently not an option for you? Because it's probably not that you're a monster and you hate children. It's probably that you have like other real things in your life that are making this either too much, or it's difficult, or you don't know where to start, or maybe you're afraid because you're like, I should just know how to do this. Like, it's just this thing that exists in the world. And so I should just automatically know how to be pregnant or how to have a kid or how to be a parent just by, I don't know, osmosis existing on the planet. And so like, there is like, we don't necessarily like as a society give people a lot of grace to learn. And that's one of the things that I think that's so important about reproductive health advocacy, like trainings and talking and stuff like that, is one of the things that I've found every single time is that most people are genuinely curious and they have deep levels of empathy, but they don't have information. And so if you give them a space where they can start to ask questions without having to fear either being, slayed or like not understood or being told that they're terrible people, like if it's a genuine curiosity, and I think most people have it, like this is, as we talked about, reproductive health matters on every area of your life, which means everyone is invested in this. Like, this is not a topic you ever have to worry about whether or not you're going to bore people. Like, people are inherently invested in talking about sex and reproductive health. Like, we're all curious about it. And the more they tell us not to talk about it, the more questions we have. So, like,
you bring up a good point with this ongoing education thing, because this is such a complex issue and it's impacted by public policy. It's impacted by culture, by norms. It's impacted by medicine and science. There's so many factors at play. Like, it's not just like, it requires continuing education because resources change and information changes. And so it does require like keeping an eye out for how these changes are occurring.
That is such a really, really good point. And I want us to try and wrap up the conversation by sticking on that topic, because I agree with everything the three of you have just said, that we do really need to focus on that partnership development where we don't have to think that we have to take on everything and provide every service, but to really tap into our allies and the other folks who are working alongside us. And a big part of that is providing continuing education and continuing to have these conversations. So I know that you all ended the training by really trying to provide Missouri-specific resources. What programs exist? What are different sorts of programming that advocates can look into to try and bring into their agency? So I'm wondering if we can just go around and give one quick plug for a resource that you think is really important for folks to know about. And, along with that, it can also be a prompt for folks to reach out to us afterwards and say, you know what, I'm really interested in learning more about that too.
I can go first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nora.
I'm a big fan of the Missouri Family Health Council. They manage all the Title X funds that come through Missouri, and those fund reproductive health clinics throughout the state. And so if you go to the Missouri Family Health Council website, they actually have a map that has a list of all of their Title X clinics and a list of all of their the Right Time Clinics. It's a program that also provides free reproductive health services. And so you can find that map and find the free services that are available in your closest to you.
Fantastic. And Missouri Family Health Council, they're definitely friends of MCA DSV. Big fans of theirs. Thanks, Nora.
Oh, I can only do one. I've got like 3 in my head. So
You know what? We're all about resource sharing. Havana, go for it.
okay. So the first one in the Kansas City area is Uzazi Village. It's UZAZI village.org. You can learn about doulas there and get access to a ton of good doulas. In the St. Louis area, there's Jamaa Birth Center, JAMAA, birthcenter.org.com. Then the last one, which also partners up with what Nora said, was Missouri Primary Care Association. That way you can see all of the healthcare centers throughout your entire state in your specific region. And hopefully soon we will be able to have open office hours with them and they can talk specifically about the agencies that are in your area. Okay, I'm done.
I would have to say, like, the program that I'm really excited about, and it was like announced not that long ago, so everything happens like, and perfect timing. But there's a partnership that was launched between the Metro Trans Umbrella Group and the Planned Parenthood of the St. Louis region and Southwest Missouri. And it's called Transforming Community, Transforming Care. And it's about figuring out ways to provide like appropriate reproductive health care and resources for people who are in the trans community. And it's being driven by people who are in the trans community who have just these abysmal failures of being able to receive reproductive health care or any sort of reproductive health education. And so creating that kind of space for that specific group who right now doesn't have the access to information and things that are as easy for someone like me to access. Like, I am a cisgendered straight lady. It's pretty easy for me to just walk into my OB and they pretty much know what's happening with me, and I can, like, there's a lot more, like, this is one of those areas where to be a cisgendered woman makes reproductive health care 1,000 times more, especially if you're straight, like 1,000 times more accessible, because that's what all these spaces are designed for. Like, even spaces that are for everybody, like they're seen as predominantly female spaces, like even Planned Parenthood and things like that. So that kind of acknowledgement that there are so many things that we can be doing, and you have to include the people from that community, but also not make it entirely their responsibility to educate the world. Like, it's that blending of teamwork where it's that your voices need to be at the table, but you also need to amplify and support those voices so they're not just yelling into the abyss, and so that they're not running themselves into the ground for the basic things that they should already have access to like live and exist and be a human. So.
Oof, good resources, y'all. Those are fantastic resources to share. And Sam, I really love what you just said about making sure that we are allowing people's voices to come to the table and also supporting them once they're there. So I think that's a really important both and, not putting all of the burden on survivors, not putting all of the burden on marginalized folks, but genuinely asking them to come to the table and valuing their knowledge and experience. Well, thank you all so much for being on this episode. I loved this conversation, loved the training that you had earlier this month. And like we've talked about, it might have been the first big kickoff, but certainly won't be the last opportunity for us to be having these conversations.
We're all pretty excited every time we get to talk about it. So
Yes, we are.
Please call us so we can talk about it more, because we can justify how much we want to talk about it if more people call and ask us about it too.
Very true.
I love ending this on a call to action, Sam. So great plug. Please call, reach out to us. We are your coalition after all. So give us a chat. And it's a topic that everyone on the prevention team loves to talk about. So we're here to be a resource.
Yep. Please call us to talk about sex.
Fantastic. And on that note, Thanks a lot, y'all.
Bye.
Yeah.